All right, so today we've got two regions of Africa that we're going to be discussing and dealing with. The first of which is going to be known as the Sahel. Okay, so the Sahel, the area that we're talking about, is going to be that in between region between the Sahara and the grasslands. So if we go to our map here, okay, we have the Sahara here, kind of in the north, and then down here near the kind of the what we call the coastal countries, we're going to have a grasslands area. This region in between that is what we're going to call the Sahel. It's not going to be completely arid. The Sahara is going to be a very, very arid, dry desert. The further south you go, the more you're going to start to see a little bit of rainfall. So the grasslands area, that area in the south, is going to be tropical. So the further north in the Sahel you go, the more dry it's going to be. The further south you go, the more kind of tropical area that you're going to find. Enough water really to support some grasslands. But that's about it. Understanding the past. There's some things, some historical things here that we gotta really be aware of to kind of understand the people that are living there. First of all, we already talked about how the Sahara Desert used to be a place that a lot of people were living in. It was very green, very lush, very, very different than what we think of it today. As the Sahara Desert starts to develop, you start to see tribes split up. Okay, as the Sahara develops in the middle, you're going to see those tribes start to go further north and further south and get further and further and further away from each other. So tribes that used to have a lot of contact suddenly had very limited contact. They realized it was important to keep that, so they continued to have contact through trade. Trade was a reason for these different groups to continue to get together. Well, as time goes on, the Sahara Desert keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And as it gets bigger, it gets more dangerous. So they quickly realize that it's going to be important to have trade routes, marked trade routes that are safe, they're secure, and are going to for sure get you from point A to point B. Um, and with that concept grew the idea of how can we potentially make money off of this, because it's going to be something that they're going to have to invest in to upkeep it, to keep it marked, to keep it safe, to keep it protected. So the chiefs of these different tribes realized that, aha, it's not just going to be us that are going to use these. Other people are going to want to use these too, to trade and get safely across the Sahara. So they started taxing the traders that were going to use it. Think of it like this. Today, if you want to go to Chicago, one of the ways that you can get there is through the toll road. You pay an additional fee to use a road that isn't going to be used by as many people because you have to pay to use it. But the roads are usually going to be a little bit nicer too. So the Chiefs are going to start to basically, start to use these trade routes as like a toll road, and they're going to become very, very wealthy because of that. There's a few major kingdoms that are going to develop because of this that we want to kind of highlight. There are more than this, but these are just three, that are in this region. Ghana is going to be one major kingdom. They were really the first ones to kind of do this. The Mali are going to do this as well. They're going to become the largest of all the kingdoms. Those two should sound familiar because they're still countries today. And then a third group called the Songhai. They were thought of to be the most educated. They took money that they were making from that, and then rather than getting bigger, they wanted to invest that in their people and become educated, and benefit from those ideas, those ways. All right. So how has it changed today? First off, which countries, modern day countries, are going to be included in what we call the Sahel? They're going to be Mauritania, Mali, Niger. I've heard Niger, I've heard Niger. Either one would be correct there. They're going to be influenced by the French, Burkina Faso, and Chad. In all of these countries, they're going to take advantage. of what they have, certainly, but there's going to be a lot of obstacles. There's going to be a lot of issues and adversity that they're going to have to overcome. First one, they're going to do some farming. You got to be able to feed yourself. They're going to do some farming. The problem is that they have very, very, very short growing seasons. So it's really going to limit what you can actually grow. Because you have such a short growing season, they're going to employ what you call shifting agriculture, where they're going to move from place to place to place to place. Because once you use a farm field once or twice, one or two growing seasons, that those nutrients aren't going to get replaced. So you have to move to a different place. That's going to cause some issues we'll talk about here in a second. They're also going to do some herding of things like camels, cattle, and sheep, which is great. But when you have this in an area that doesn't have a whole lot of grasslands to start with, that's going to lead to some overgrazing. So if you put your shifting agriculture, your overgrazing together, people using with the shifting agriculture things like slash and burn farming. What little forest area you have is going to be depleted. That's all going to be a recipe for desertification. The Sahara Desert getting larger and larger and larger. Think back to yesterday when we talked about how having the tree was going to help protect the plants that are underneath it, that are covering the ground. Well, here you're not going to have that. You're going to have drought type conditions. So ultimately, because of the things that humans are doing there, because of the drought type conditions, you're seeing that the Sahara is getting larger and larger and larger as a result. Now, we have here refugees, and it says aid is difficult. This part of the world, and I'll show you a map here. Okay, this part of the world is an area that has a lot of refugee population, a lot of people that are fleeing from violence in Sudan. Sudan and South Sudan used to be one country. A lot of people fleeing there because of ethnic violence that was going on. A lot of people fleeing drought, a lot of people fleeing hunger, starvation, things like that. So you get a lot of people in this part of the world that are trying to find some place where they can live and not have to face these things. So it says in your notes there that aid is difficult. You got a lot of people here that have a lot of needs. So you would think that, okay, well, you just got to find some people to give them the things that they need. The reality is that's not in short supply. There's plenty of people in wealthy countries all around the world that want to help out. So what are the issues that they face? Well, most of the people that you're seeing that are in refugee camps are in places like this. Okay, so they're not on the coastal areas. So first of all, there's really no direct way to get to the people. In order to get to them where they're living, you have to go through other countries. So if I'm bringing, let's say, I don't know, water and wheat in from America, if the people are in Mali, I've got to go through a couple different countries before I get to the actual refugees. Every country that I go through, they're going to want their cut. They're going to want part of what it is that you're bringing. So ultimately, by the time you get it to the refugees, most of the time the amount has been greatly depleted. So there's just not enough of it available. Okay, so the first big problem is getting it through those other countries and having enough left over for the refugees that it's intended for. Second big problem that you face is once you get it there, now how is it getting out to the people? The problem that you're finding in a lot of these places where refugees are living is there are basically gangs and led by what we would call warlords, and these are people that have access to weapons and kind of prey on places like this where you've got refugees that don't have much. They probably don't have weapons to defend themselves. So if you've got somebody who does have some weapons, that's going to make it very, very difficult. So what happens is, let's say the Red Cross or somebody, they come in and they drop some supplies here in Mali. Well, what happens a lot of times is before it can get to the refugees that it's intended, The people with the guns and the knives and the machetes and things like that show up and take it before it can actually get to the refugees that it's intended for. So the second big problem is actually getting it in the hands of the people that it's intended for. Now, on your instructions, it says something about an SNL video. What I want you to do is I want you to hit pause on this and go over and watch that. It's going to make a lot more sense if we have you watch that right after this because it's talking specifically about this particular issue. The video is a little bit dated. It's from when Bill Clinton was president, but the problem still exists today. So go over, watch the SNL clip. All right. So now that you've watched that, hopefully, yeah, it should have been a little bit funny, but it makes a point. The idea of warlords, being a major, major problem. It was a major problem back then in the late '80s, early '90s, and it is still a problem today. All right. So finally, planning for the future. What is it that we're trying to do to get through to the future of this region in Africa? First off, they've got three main goals, and they're going to sound kind of silly. First one, withstand the environment. Just figure out how are we going to continue to live from day to day to day. We take for granted in our country that, hey, you know what, I'm going to wake up tomorrow and I'm not going to have any kind of problems that I'm going to have to deal with that involve me not surviving. They have to deal with that on a daily basis. Second, develop your natural resources. Sounds kind of silly, but when you're in a place that doesn't have a lot of natural resources, doesn't have a lot of government representation, doesn't have a lot of outside contacts, developing natural resources can be difficult. And then third, make the most of the human resources and cultures that you have. There's people that have been living there for a long, long time. What are some of the things that they're doing that can maybe help in other ways? Next thing here, need continued foreign aid. This is a place that if it's going to have a future, they have to get money from the outside. It's just the way it is. They don't have a whole lot of their own to go on. They have to get help from the outside, which there are places and people that are willing to help. For example, back in 2005, a group called the G8 or Great Eight, eight of the wealthiest countries in the world, canceled $40 billion in debt from 18 countries. That sounds great, but when you actually do the math, it's not as good as it sounds. Um, Eight of the wealthiest countries in the world canceling $40 billion. That's about $5 billion each. You look at the budgets for some of those countries, $5 billion to them really isn't a whole lot of money, unfortunately. Um, and the debt that the 18 countries had. Okay, so let's round it out. Let's say it's about $2 billion each. That sounds great, but it's not like, hey, we're giving you $2 billion in cash. It's really just saying that, hey, you owed us money. We're saying you don't have to pay $2 billion of it back. The reality is, were those countries ever probably going to pay that back? Probably not. They were probably never going to be in a position to be able to do that. And for the eight countries that it's coming from, like I say, $5 billion, it's really not, it's a drop in the bucket to them. So it sounds good. It looks good on a headline in a newspaper. Reality is, does it really change anything for the people living in these 18 countries? Not really. The natural resources they do have that they could develop, Senegal and Niger rivers. Rivers sound like a weird natural resource to have, but in a place that doesn't have a lot of water, having access or controlling water is power. Iron ore, bauxite, copper. Uranium is another big one, primarily because uranium is used in anything nuclear. There are, for example, the United States, countries that will pay very big money to the people that are operating these mines to make sure that that is not going to fall into the wrong hands. So the people that are controlling that actually are doing quite well. And human resources, we've already talked about. People live there for a long time. What can we do that can maybe benefit us long term? If there were one country that we could point to that we would say, hey, they've really got a chance to change something, it's going to be Mali, and here's why. They've become democratic. Their economy has been growing by a lot. 5% is a big jump. They've privatized businesses. They've made freedom of the press. That sounds an awful lot like countries like the United States. Bottom line is Mali is trying to make themselves look like a lot of the wealthy countries of the world. So when it comes time to, hey, who do we want to work with out there in Africa? Mali makes a heck of a lot of sense because they're going to look like a lot of the places that have the money to be able to help.